So, what happened to Indonesia's entrepreneurial class? I mean, it's a huge question, right? And you might think the answer is all about modern economics or today's policies, but it's not. The real answer, the deep answer, is actually buried way back in history, in culture, and in the very instincts of how people govern. You hear people point to culture all the time as the reason for Indonesia's, let's say, weaker than expected entrepreneurial scene. But it's usually just a throwaway line, right? Well, the source for this explainer says, no, we have to take culture seriously as this massive long-term force. And here's why that matters so much. In a place where social standing and what your family expects of you are absolutely huge, if you ignore culture, your policies are just going to completely miss the mark. They won't understand why people actually decide to either take a risk or, more often, to avoid it. Okay, so to really get to the bottom of this, we've got to go back, way back. See, the situation today isn't the beginning of the story. Not even close. It's actually the end result of a long and honestly often overlooked history. We're about to see how a really vibrant past was, well, systematically taken apart. And this is so important. We need to be asking the right question. It's easy to ask, why doesn't Indonesia have more entrepreneurial energy? But that's the wrong way to look at it. The real question, the one that changes everything, is what happened to the energy that was already there? How did a society with so much commercial spirit have that spirit weakened so badly? Because, get this, here's the historical reality. If you could go back to the 15th and 16th centuries, you'd see that the archipelago had a booming merchant class. And we're not talking about small-time local traders here. No way. These were major players, seriously big deals, operating across these huge regional and even international networks. They were deep and high-level, sophisticated commerce. So what happened? Where did it all go? Well, as you can kind of see from this timeline, that flourishing class was just dramatically weakened, and it happened in less than 2 centuries. The key thing to understand is that this wasn't some natural decline, like things just fading away. Nope, this was a systematic process, driven by colonial monopolies and extraction that actively and intentionally dismantled this independent commercial class. And this quote, man, it just gets right to the heart of the long-term cultural damage. See, the problem wasn't just external. A lot of local rulers were brought into the system, co-opted, which just squeezed the space for any independent business. Think about it. If you know that all your hard work can be seized at any moment, well, you're going to be cautious, right? It becomes a survival strategy. It was never about laziness. It was a perfectly rational, learned response to a system that punished you for trying. Okay, so let's fast forward to the present day, because this is where it all connects. This history is so crucial because even though the players have changed, the language is different. Some of those old governing instincts, that preference for top-down control instead of just letting things grow, they can reappear in modern policy, and here's the kicker. It's often with the best of intentions. So here it is, the central issue right now. The country says, we want more entrepreneurs. But then you look at the design of some policies and they completely bypass local people and businesses. They centralize control, and by doing that, they actually shrink the very space where an independent business could pop up and grow. It's that same old habit, just in a new disguise. Okay, let's make this super concrete. Take a centralized meal program, for example. It's a great goal, right? Totally noble. But when the design forces the price per meal down to something like 6,500 rupiah, that's less than 50 US cents, it can end up bypassing and even weakening the local food sellers who are already there. I mean, you have to ask, what kind of truly nutritious meal can a small local kitchen possibly make for that price without either skimping on quality or just slowly going broke? And you see this same reflex with things like top-down cooperatives. A co-op that's just created by some government office decree, it's a totally different animal from one that grows organically from the ground up, out of real local need, mutual trust, and a sense of shared ownership. One is a living, breathing thing. The other, it just risks becoming an empty shell. And here's a third example, and it's a big one. The state becomes both the referee and the strongest player on the field. Think about that. When the regulator is also your biggest competitor in the market, that old pattern comes right back. The space for any new autonomous entrepreneur to even compete to find their footing, it just shrinks dramatically. Look, the stakes here are incredibly high. The real danger, the absolute risk, is that the country is trying to solve today's problems with policy tools that are quietly and unintentionally recreating the very same damage that was done to its entrepreneurial class hundreds of years ago. And what you end up with is this whole series of paradoxes.
You get leaders praising self-reliance, while the policies actually create more dependency on managed systems. You get centralized distribution that weakens local ownership, and you can end up spending huge amounts of money on programs that create a lot of paperwork and administration, but not a lot of actual new entrepreneurs.
So all of this funnels down into something you can actually see every day, a cultural preference for a stable, salaried job. A safe job. And this isn't some random quirk of the culture. It's a direct, logical result of a long history where going out on your own was punished and being a salaried employee was safe. And that preference gets reinforced over and over by today's institutions and incentives. All right, so what's the solution? I mean, it's one thing to diagnose the problem, but what can actually be done about it? Changing culture can take generations, for sure, and we can't just sit around and wait. The good news is there are practical, short-term things that can be done to start breaking this cycle, like right now. So the source lays out a really clear 4-step path. Step 1, stop bypassing the real, living local businesses that are already there. When you have social programs, use them to buy from neighborhood suppliers. Let them grow with real contracts. Step 2, let co-ops grow from the bottom up, out of need and trust, not just from a top-down government order. Step 3, keep the state in its lane as the rule setter, the enabler, not as a giant commercial competitor. And finally, step 4, and this one's huge, make it socially okay to be an entrepreneur. Make it so that trying and failing isn't seen as some kind of terrible social mistake. So at the end of the day, the crucial point isn't about giving more speeches or coming up with better slogans about entrepreneurship. The real solution is in the nuts and bolts, the fundamental design of the policies themselves. It's about designing fewer programs that say they support entrepreneurs, while their inner workings are actually pushing them to the sidelines. And this brings us right to the core warning of this whole thing. You know that saying, history doesn't repeat, but it rhymes? Well, here, the real danger is that the same old instinct for top-down control just puts on a modern costume. It gets slicker slogans, newer packaging, but underneath it all, the habit, the instinct, is exactly the same. Ultimately, if the goal is a truly thriving entrepreneurial future, the test is actually pretty simple. Policymakers need to stop asking, how can we organize society more tightly from above? Instead, they need to start asking a totally different question. How do we just widen the room? How do we make more space for our citizens to own things, to supply things, to trade, to grow, to fail, to get back up, and to try again? That fundamental shift from controlling to enabling, that's the whole ballgame. And it really leaves us with a final thought, doesn't it? This idea of an old instinct wearing a new costume. It's a really powerful way to look at the world. So the question for you is, where else might this be happening? In other countries? In completely different areas of policy? Where else can we see this exact same pattern at play?